Good to have you here. We have an incredibly exciting program for you this afternoon. Today's Fireside Chat is the first in a series led by Mervyn King, so please be on the lookout for invitations to future events. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest of honor, Rachel Maddow. Rachel is the host, as you know, of the Emmy Award-winning Rachel Maddow Show on MSNBC and author of the New York Times bestseller, Drift, The Unmooring of American Military Power. Upon debuting in September 2008, the Rachel Maddow Show received instant acclaim. The Washington Post named it one of the top shows of the decade and named Rachel Breakout Star of 2008. I'm trying to embarrass her. The Los Angeles Times named her to the best television of 2008, and Politico named her one of the top 10 political newcomers of 2008. Since her debut, as you know, Rachel has enjoyed a meteoric rise to the top and has won a slew of awards, too many to name here today. We're thrilled to have her here. And interviewing Rachel is our very own Lord Mervyn King. As you know, Mervyn is on the faculty. He's the Greenspan Professor of Economics here at the Stern School, served as Governor of the Bank of England, was knighted in 2011, made a life peer in 2013, and is practically a member of royalty, as it were. So please join me in welcoming Lord Mervyn King and Rachel Maddow.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. This is a new series of events that we're going to hold, and the first choice of everyone at Stern for the first guest in this series was indeed Rachel Maddow. So a warm welcome to Rachel. Now, the Rachel Maddow Show is different. It's a news program, but it doesn't have the bland balance of reporting that you get from many of them. It's an edgy show. But interestingly, it's not based on opinions. It's based on facts. You keep finding amazing facts from all over the place. Why did you decide to create a news program like this? And why do you think it's so popular?
I thoroughly embrace the premise of your question, which is that it's so popular. That's a nice place to start. I came to being on television from being in radio, and I came to being on television as a person who did not have a television because I did not feel that I needed one, because I did not feel like there was anything going on television that required my attention other than football. And I figured out a way to pirate that through the laptop, watching through Bulgaria. So Susan and I were illegally watching football, and other than that, there was no need for TV. And I think the reason that I wasn't moved by TV is that I felt like it was people discussing things I already knew. And my job in radio was to discuss things in the news, and I didn't necessarily want to listen to other people's opinions and, ape them. I wanted to learn new stuff. And so my approach to TV from the beginning was to try to do it in a way that would add more useful information to the world. And so I tried to I definitely will tell you what my opinion is, and I make no bones about where I'm coming from and who I am and what I believe, but I try to explain things in a way that add to people's understanding of the news and our country and our politics. And that is, I think that desire to explain things just has me approach things in a different way.
How do you select the stories? Because what is different about your show is that it does have a remarkable number of stories that no one else would have imagined were out there. And you find them. How do you go about choosing these?
I think I get more credit for that than I deserve. I think I talk about a lot of the same stories that other people talk about. I just talk about them in weird ways. And so the context that I provide is relevant to understanding something, or where I'd put something in a historical timeline. So you could, what I present as the relevant chronology might be different, but in the end, we're all dealing with the same things that happened in the world today. I do make an effort to try to read broadly. First, I don't read other opinion. I don't read anybody else who's commenting on the news. I try to kind of put blinders on about that because I don't want to absorb anybody else's opinion. But then in terms of assessing the universe of news on a given day, my staff, we all read a note that is sort of a digest produced by a senior producer of what's going on in the world. And then other people have beats, which are mostly regional. And so, some of them are issue specific, but some of them are regional. And so I think the only thing we do differently in terms of finding other news is that we try to pay attention to the Birmingham News in Alabama, or the Deseret News in Utah, or some of the print press in major European countries. Or I think we do try to read more broadly, but we try to tell stories in new ways. I'm not necessarily sure we always tell new stories.
You've managed to avoid the temptation which a number of radio shows and TV shows have fallen into, of having someone expressing sort of outrage at what is going on. You actually produce facts for your viewers. That is very different. How did you decide that this was going to be your approach?
When I first started getting booked on television, I was coming from this radio world. I was working, my first radio job was in an unrated tertiary market in Western New England. Like, literally nobody in the market paid for ratings, so who knows who was winning. And then I went from there, and I ended up getting a job at a national talk radio outfit called Air America, which existed for 5 minutes. But from there, we started right around the time of the 2004 election, and one material consequence of that is that the bookers from all the cable news shows in the world saw us as fresh meat, liberals that you can put on to fight with conservatives, because that's what cable news is supposed to be about. And so that's how I was fed as fodder into that machine as a liberal starting in 2004, and it was just a Punch and Judy show. We'd put you up. They put me up with the first time I was ever on CNN. It was the bald guy who went to prison for Watergate. G. Gordon Liddy. Me and G. Gordon Liddy. I was like, you were in jail when I was born. I was like, oh, that's a weird thing. And then I would get matched up with Pat Buchanan, and Pat Buchanan and I would fight. And I think World War II was worth fighting, Pat. And we'd have these great fights, and it was civil mostly, but and it was sometimes fun. But it was also, in the end, just kinetic activity. It was a fight for the purpose of having a fight. And so I don't say that has no value, and I don't say that it isn't fun sometimes. And actually, I get along really well with Uncle Pat. But when I got my own show and I got to be in control of programming it, I sort of vowed I would never put anybody in that position. I don't want to fight just for the sake of fighting. And I also don't want sort of empty expressions of outrage for the sake of emotional display. It's okay, I think, to show a little bit of emotion, to allow yourself to be read in terms of how you are reacting to something, but a little goes a long way. And too much, I think, is toxic.
So an awful lot of TV shows do have, the presenter in the middle, and then they have two guests, and these two guests are supposed to attack each other and say, and it ends up being a rather pointless exercise, predictable and rather pointless. You haven't gone down that route, but when you started, it was a bit of a gamble for NBC, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Were they very nervous about it?
It was a weird, maybe it's just, poor judgment on their part. I don't know. But when I started, they gave me my show in 2008, and MSNBC, the network that I'm on, had started to become sort of identifiably liberal, at least in some hours of the day, just a couple of years before that. The first breaks, I think, happened around Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and there started to be sort of interruption of what had been previously a pretty rah-rah approach to the Bush administration at that point. And I think that was the anchors being honest about how they felt. I think it was also them reflecting the way the country was kind of started to turn against the Bush administration at that time. And then heading into 2006 and 2007, particularly around the Iraq War, it just felt like there was a business, I don't know if it was a business decision made. I think there was a sort of strategic decision made that there was room for that voice existed organically in the country, and that people had a hunger to hear things sort of from that point of view, or at least reflecting that back. And so they were already moving in that direction. I'm not sure how well thought out it was. It does sort of feel like it was an organic thing. I never remember there being some sort of big branding decision, we shall be liberal. But they were shifting that way, and that was definitely the moment at which they were willing to bring me on. But they did take risks. I was the first openly gay person to ever host a news show in the country. I'm not sure they knew how that was going to go. I'm a woman hosting a primetime show, which is a rare thing. I'm a woman who looks like a dude who was hosting a primetime show. I mean, there's most of the women in cable news are very pretty, and that's not me. And I also wanted to do things differently. I didn't want to put on panels of guests. In fact, I wanted to put on very small numbers of guests.
Yes.
And when I started leading my shows with, 15-minute monologues that started with obscure historical references and stayed on them for a long time, I think there was a little agita. But, then nothing succeeds like success. So you sort of got to prove that people want it.
Last week on the show, you had a fascinating piece in which you went back 4 years to a speech by a former Supreme Court Justice, David Souter, who talked about the need for democracy to require an informed electorate. An educated electorate is necessary. And he said at that point that if people at the center of government couldn't solve the problems that people saw in front of them, it would open the way for someone to say, if you give me all the power, I will solve the problems. Very prescient in the light of this year's election. Why do you think people have got to the stage of being potentially or partially receptive to that message in America today?
He gave that answer in response to a question about civic education, about whether or not Americans have lost something as we have moved away from the expectation that through public schooling everybody will get a little bit of an education in civics. And I think it's a very profound point that he was making, but it's also very, very specific. He was saying, if we do not understand enough about the way that we are governed, the way that we govern ourselves, that when something goes wrong, when something isn't working in the country, we don't know enough about our system to know who is responsible, who ought to have made that better, who you should go to redress those grievances, or who caused this problem, then you, in an inchoate way, blame the system. You assume that democracy doesn't work, that our system of government doesn't work, and you're willing to hand it to somebody who says, it's a disaster, the country's a disaster, your government is a disaster, everybody's stupid, I'm smart, I'll do it. And it's born not, every society has problems, and in every era of American life, we've had in seemingly intractable problems. But his argument is that what's different now is that we are ignorant, willfully or otherwise, about how government is supposed to work to solve these problems. And that is fixable, which is, I think, the hopeful thing about what he said, even if it was scary how much he predicted what's going on, I think, with the Republican presidential nominee this year.
So let me contrast this with FDR, who did a number of things to almost take control in the presidency of issues where people thought, hang on, he's stretching the powers further than was ever expected. But people looking back say, well, he did solve the problems, and on the left, he's regarded as a great hero. But he did say, if you give me the power, I will solve the problems, did he not?
Yeah, absolutely. And he pushed things further than they could go. The rebuff of him trying to pack the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
It infuriates me when people say now, when a judge is nominated to a court, they say, oh, he's packing the court. Now, packing the court is actually a thing. Packing the court means changing the number of seats on a court so that you can, the way that FDR tried to do, with some of the things that he tried to do in terms of government intrusion into the business sector. He was rebuffed in ways that no president will ever be able to even try to do it again, or at least there'll be a constitutional bright line there for him. And so, FDR, I think, was motivated because of the challenges he saw facing the country. I think what he saw as existential challenges facing the country, economically in particular, to try to do everything himself. And the country, had he not died in office, how many terms would FDR have had? There's a reason we had to change a lot of systems after FDR was gone. His effectiveness as a leader, I think, is separated now from the way that we view that instinct. But it shows you how hard he pushed, that he had to get pushed back.
If we turn to this year's election, in many ways Donald Trump looks like the perfect candidate to run against out of central casting. And yet, despite the fact that he might have been tailor-made to be the ideal opponent, he will probably get over 45% of the total people voting for the two main candidates. What do you think are the frustrations in the American people that lead them to be willing to cast so many votes for someone who, on the face of it, looks like the candidate from hell?
He doesn't have the, twirly mustache ends, yes, but I mean, listen, in some ways, I'll take issue with the premise a little bit. In some ways, I think that Donald Trump is a very, very good candidate. The Republican primary process was, on paper, designed to produce what you'd expect to be the most competent candidate. I mean, you'd expect somebody who gets through the primary process to be, especially with the bench that was out there, right? For all these former senators and governors and previous candidates and people who, in the case of Chris Christie, people who they had been clamoring for him to run in 2012. So all of these very plausible candidates, all running against each other, all running hard in an interesting campaign finance environment in which they were, Jeb Bush had $100 billion, but a lot of other people had their own billionaires too, and they were all going to be able to compete on money. And you'd expect somebody arising out of that competition to be tested by fire and a very good candidate and really ready for the general election. Whereas Hillary Clinton is going to be running against Bernie Sanders, and that's it, really? Instead, what you ended up with was Bernie Sanders running a really good campaign against Hillary Clinton, and on the Republican side, Donald Trump just dominating. And I don't think it can be blamed on, Bobby Jindal being unexpectedly terrible, or, or Chris Christie being unable to get out of his own way. I mean, there were failures at an individual level, but when you've got 17 of them, stop thinking it's an individual problem. Donald Trump did very, very well running against those guys, and he did it by seeming different than all of them. He allowed them all to split all of the different types of Republican vote, always leaving himself outside the competition that they had amongst themselves. And he was masterful in his media strategy. And I know that everybody blames us in the media for how much TV time Donald Trump got. But Donald Trump did that as a political strategy. He made sure that every time he opened up his mouth at a live event, there was a very good chance that he was going to say something that drove people absolutely crazy. By breaking a taboo, by insulting someone to a degree that they would have to respond, and they would likely respond in a way that would also make news. He would unveil some outrageous policy that nobody could see coming, a ban on Muslims, right? He would do something that was politically sort of earth-shaking almost every time he opened his mouth. And so that guaranteed, in the economy of news, that every network it would pay to have a camera there and a correspondent there, as well as your microphones there, because when something happened, that was going to be the news. And so he got live coverage. And who was going to compete with that? He's not the world's greatest speaker. He's not actually that charismatic a person. He's not a great orator. He's boring when you actually read his speeches. They don't make very much sense. But I don't mean it in an ad hominem way. Like, read his transcripts. When you read Sarah Palin's transcripts, there's a little poetry there. Like, she's a little wacky, but they're hard to follow, but she has ideas. Donald Trump just reiterates these same three-word sentences with single syllables. But he's good at making you expect that something's about to happen. And that is a form of political media strategy that dominated all of those other supposedly good politicians. And he won fair and square by a lot. And I think the Republican Party has to answer for why their traditionally skilled candidates couldn't stand up against it.
Does this pose a challenge not just to the Republican Party, but to the Democrats as well for the future? If someone can be outrageous and get publicity, and publicity is a prerequisite of being a serious candidate, then this is a very bad incentive. Someone who is calm and reasonable, and you might think would impress this audience if they explain their policies, might actually not get any coverage and find it very hard to break through. And if the debates are going to be chosen on the basis of who's in the opinion polls, then you've got to do something to get your head above water and to be noticed. Yeah. How is this going to play out in the future?
Well, I think in the short term, I don't have unique insight into the way the Democrats are approaching this, but I think that part of the reason the Democrats are competing in Utah and in Missouri and in, maybe not Idaho, but, Arizona and all these other places where it's not just that they have a chance. They don't actually have to win those places in order to beat Donald Trump to 270 electoral votes. I think part of the reason they are competing in these places, Indiana, these other places where they don't have to win, is because they want to send a message about a person like that not being worthy of the American people's vote. And they want to beat him all over the country. They want to maximize the number of states that she wins. They want to, I don't know that it's this personal, but I think they want to humiliate him, because I think they want to send a sort of civics message that's not the path to success. That may be a path to celebrity, and it may be a path toward tactical advantage, but the American people will reject you in the end, and in a big way. And so there's a very interesting sort of tactical decisions happening within the Democratic Party. A lot of people in the Democratic Party are saying, stop campaigning in Utah. Yeah, it'd be hilarious if you won Utah, but it doesn't matter. You're still going to win the presidency. Instead, spend that money so that you can get more Senate candidates or House candidates from upstate New York and from, rural Indiana and from other places where you might otherwise, spend that on state legislatures or governors. It's a very interesting thing, but I think part of it is this concern about what we leave the country as the lesson of Trumpism. And I think there's a lot of worry from historically minded Democrats that the lesson right now might look like Goldwater 64. The lesson that I think people in mainstream political analysis take from Beltway 64 is that, Barry Goldwater got shellacked, but actually he won. It just took him 16 years to win the vote. It took him until 1980 when Ronald Reagan ran on the same platform with a shinier cast on it to actually win, and that became his supposed extremism became mainstream Republican politics. I think Democrats are very concerned that Trumpism might become mainstream Republican politics, just with a shinier cast when you get somebody who's more palatable to run on it again in 4 years or 8 years or 12 or 16. So how you get rid of Trumpism, I think, is as much a concern for the Democrats as it is for the Republicans. There's a possibility that Trump might win, in which case this conversation is very different. B, there's the question of whether there will be some sort of schismatic impulse within the Republican Party when this is done, because they'll see Trump voters as unincorporable to the next entity that calls itself Republican.
So you haven't said anything so far about the idea that Trump voters may be the people who feel they've been left behind by the prosperity created by globalization, and that they look at people in Washington, perhaps they don't really understand what they're seeing, but they see a group of people in the US who've done phenomenally well in the last 20 years, and these people attract a lot of publicity, and they haven't done so well, and they feel left behind, and they feel their children have been left even further behind. Are these not the people whom Trump is exploiting, and doesn't that pose a big challenge for the next president?
What's remarkable is that those folks would pick a real estate billionaire from New York.
It is, but
that's and that goes to the heart of your question, right? Which is, if those folks that you were just describing are an important political force and an important sociological segment to sort of reckon with in terms of American growth and globalization, then how do their needs get constructively challenged into a way that's politically helpful to them? Electing Donald Trump will not address meaningfully the policy needs of that group of folks. It really won't. He's tapped into it, and he's made, I am your voice. I alone can fix it. He's told people that he's speaking for them. There's nothing that he's planning on doing as president if he were elected that would address any of those concerns. Really, like renegotiating NAFTA at this point is not going to help. And that's the most substantive thing that he said he's going to do. Yes.
Well, that is certainly true, but on the other hand, none of the other candidates on the Republican side, nor I think Hillary Clinton with her links to the establishment, having been there for so long, appear to offer much prospect of change. Yeah. So you could, it seems to me that the argument would be, he's a bit wacky, but under him, that's the only chance of things changing.
Just because he'd be a shock to the system?
Yes.
Yeah.
That seems to be the basis of it.
It is a strange argument, though, substantively. I mean, that's essentially the argument that was made in the Las Vegas Review-Journal editorial endorsement of Trump yesterday. It's just the first major newspaper that's endorsed Trump, and it's run by Sheldon Adelson, who's a very, 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 very wealthy Republican donor. And their argument was, we can't vote for Hillary Clinton. We have to vote for this flawed candidate because we've got to change this system that rewards the wealthy. Well, okay, Sheldon, we should vote for Donald because we're worried about rewarding the wealthy? I mean, okay. There is something that's, there's the diagnosis of the problem is not wrong. The proposed solution is insane. Yeah. And eventually somebody will figure out how to offer a more sane solution to that very real problem. I think that, honestly, that the Clinton-Kaine administration, if they win, is going to have to set about doing that. And I think they're cognizant of that. I mean, I think that when you look at their politics and what they're talking about and the way they campaign and what they're trying to offer, they may not embody the form of change that people want in terms of a shock to the system, but what they're offering substantively is a lot of stuff that would help.
So there's a very interesting scene in the film Primary Colors, which was this fictionalized version of the Bill Clinton campaign back in '92, in which John Travolta, as Bill Clinton, goes into a textile factory in New Hampshire, and these people have lost jobs and their wages have been squeezed, exactly as we think has happened to many people today. And first of all, he does it, of course, in his own unique way, is to empathize with the group and really explain how, as a poor boy from Arkansas, he understands the problems that they're facing. But then he goes on to say to them, but I want to tell you I cannot bring the jobs back. And he explains why, but he explains what he will do for their children. The next generation will have better education, which will enable them not to suffer from the decline of this industry. And they give him a standing ovation because A, he empathized with them, and B, he's being honest with them.
Yeah.
The trouble is that the successor, now his wife, it's very much harder for her to do that because the next 25 years actually didn't do a lot for the children and the next generation, and the problems are still there. I mean, is this not the challenge for the next president?
Yes, and it's a challenge for the two-party system. I mean, part of the reason that Donald Trump is going to get 40 to 45% of the vote if things go as they do now is because we've decided that we have partisan tribes, and you're born into one, and it's almost like we're politically segregated. You vote based on where you live. That is not a helpful way to divide the country in terms of having good political arguments. What the Democratic Party says it believes in and says it stands for is the prospect of working class people in this country and middle class people in this country. And when Bill Clinton did his sort of new labor reinvention of the Democratic Party in the 90s, he was the one who expanded it from saying the Democratic Party stands for working people and the middle class and the wealthy. He tried to say we're for everybody. But supposedly the roots of the Democratic Party are for people who sign the backs of their paychecks, not the people who sign the front. And that is something that Democrats have gotten very woolly on. That's what Bernie Sanders banged like a drum so effectively throughout this primary. I think it's what Elizabeth Warren and her sort of wing of the Democratic Party right now stands for super aggressively. The Republican Party actually has had a few people over the years who have tried to recast the Republican Party as standing for that part of the country. Rick Santorum, for how ridiculous he was on social issues, to the point where it almost occluded everything else about him and you couldn't understand anything else he was saying, actually had a great populist message that sounded more like John Edwards than anybody else in terms of talking about the poor and working class and middle class sliding into working class and working class sliding into poor, and there being no route out of it anymore the way there used to be. Mike Huckabee back in the day, before he became a weight loss guru and all the other crazy things he became, Mike Huckabee also had a lot to say on that issue and made some decisions as Arkansas governor that were substantively really good in terms of economic inequality and economic opportunity in that very poor state. So there have been these impulses, but neither party is sort of natively and organically oriented that way anymore. They both fight it, and big money and corporate money in politics helps that, drives you into the moneyed interests in terms of who actually funds you. And it takes these aggressive ideological challenges from the left within each party in order to try to bring them back to that.
Let me ask you one more question about the future of American politics. When I started studying American politics, I'd never been to America, and I had this wonderful vision that these great colourful figures would travel across the US on trains, and every time they'd come to a small town, the train would stop and they'd stand on the back of the train, speak to the population, their vision of the country. Now we seem to have got to a point where they're surrounded by pollsters who design individual messages for individual voters. And you had a fascinating piece last night on the show about redistricting, thinking about clever ways of using money, knowing that redistricting will take place down the road. Let's focus on winning the small elections in smaller states, smaller regions, in order to get control of the redistricting process.
Right.
It's become super scientific.
Yeah.
It's the Moneyball theory of politics. Is this bad for our democracy? Can we do anything about it?
It's super exciting for political analysis, I will tell you. When you actually have something to talk about that involves math, instead of just like, who can string a sentence together and who's got a sex scandal and who's like, the personality candidate-driven policy analysis, such as it is mostly theater criticism. And it's frustrating and it gets boring over time, even when you've got candidates as rambunctious and over the top as people like Donald Trump. So as somebody whose job is to explain what's going on, for me, people will say, you know why these guys who have never met a politician from Alabama just spent hedge fund money earned in New York on an Alabama state Senate race? It's because the Alabama state Senate race, that particular seat, if it flipped, would flip control, which means after the census, they get to redistrict, which means Alabama will never have another black member of Congress. Like, ta-da! having processes like that to observe and unpack and explain, to me, it makes my work very rewarding. In terms of whether or not it makes it less inspirational to cover American politics, I mean, I find intellectual ambition to be inspiring too. We did a thing on the Lincoln-Douglas debates not long ago. They really did, stop at all these little towns across Illinois and get tens of thousands of people to turn out and watch those debates, and they're so amazing. And Lincoln and Douglas were both incredible orators. And boy, you look back and Douglas's arguments were pretty terrible now, but they were really well delivered. But Douglas won. That wasn't the presidential. That was the Senate race in Illinois. And as brilliant as Lincoln was in those debates and as beautiful as that process was, Douglas was the bad guy. And Douglas won, and ultimately he won that battle, but Lincoln won the argument, and that's how paved his path to the presidency years later. And so I do still think there's romance and there's drama and there's character, but it has to be on a deliberate, planned path in some ways too, and I find that exciting as well.
Now, in a minute, I want to open the questions to those of you in the audience to put a question to Rachel. But I got one more question I must ask you about. Today, you're a famous television news presenter, come top of the rankings. Everyone talks about your show. But that didn't start like that. You had to work jolly hard to get into it. How did it all come about? And when you were at college, what were your ambitions and aspirations?
First of all, thank you. That's very nice of you to say it that way. I would not recommend my path as a model. When I was in college, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was born in 1973, and then I went to college when I was 17. So I went to college in 1990. And I came out as gay when I was a teenager, and in 1989, 1990 in the San Francisco Bay Area, that was, the burning cauldron of the AIDS crisis. And so I was coming out, recognizing myself to be part of a community that was absolutely under siege in a way that was galvanizing and scary and more important than it felt like anything else was going on in the world. And so I went to college, but my heart was not in it. my heart was really in the AIDS activist movement because I felt like my community was fighting for its life. And I wanted to be doing that. And so I sort of started doing AIDS activism when I was 16 and 17, did that all through college, got out of college as fast as I could because I wanted to move to San Francisco and be part of ACT UP. And I did. I was never the world's most successful activist, but that was really what I felt like was the most important thing. I actually chose my major based on two things. One is I wanted to be able to win arguments, the kinds of arguments that I had been making as an activist with people who had more expertise than me in those fields. And so I did a major in public policy with an emphasis in statistics and a focus on health policy. And then I did an honors program, which is essentially a minor in philosophy, because I wanted to get better at making good arguments. And I took 35 units of statistics, and I wanted to get better at what I was already doing. I essentially approached college as a vocational technical opportunity. And I don't know if that was the right thing to do. I think if I went back now, I'd just do history. But I worked in activism. I ended up getting a scholarship and doing a PhD that was based on the type of activism that I had been doing. And I really thought that was going to be my life. And because of the kid that I was and the place and the time I grew up in, I never, ever thought about getting old or planning ahead or having a career because I was in an environment where that wasn't my cohort's experience. And so I did not plan ahead. But ultimately, I ended up taking odd jobs while I was trying to finish my dissertation. And one of the very odd jobs that I took, it was one of, I think, 4 jobs I had at the time, was being the sidekick on a radio show, like a morning zoo radio show. I had to wear an inflatable calculator suit. Come on down, win tickets, I'll stand in the median. And it turns out I really enjoyed it. And I did that for exactly a year, from 1999 to 2000. From 2000 to 2001. And then I stopped doing that and went back to Oxford to do my orals, to get my PhD. And a week after I did my orals, 9/11 happened. And I had been off the air for 6 months at that point. And I had this, and I thought that was my 1 year in radio, and that was the only broadcasting I'd ever do. And when 9/11 happened, I had the same, I wasn't in New York, I was in Massachusetts. I had the same helpless feeling and desire to, give blood or do whatever we could do that we all had. And I realized one thing that I could do is get on the radio and give information. All the music radio stations stopped playing music and started just doing news and talk and letting people, get information and explain what was going on. And I just volunteered to come back in on the radio for no pay and said, put me on weekend shifts. I'd like to help. And again, I didn't do anything profound, but I realized that I missed that opportunity to explain stuff to people about what was going on in the world. And that is how I ended up doing this. It's a weird
It sounds
path.
as if you followed what you really believed in, and serendipity took care of the rest.
I tried to do what I was good at and that I felt like needed to be done.
Right.
And I took opportunities when they came up.
Wonderful. Now, who would like to ask the first question? We've got microphones here on the side. There's a question here.
It's on the way.
Can you please keep the question short and just say your name?
Yes, it will be short. My name is Jonathan. Thank you very much for speaking with us today. In short, my question is, it seems as if there have been more threats against the objective portrayal of the news. Commercial interests have always had adverse effects with the objective portrayal. My question is, what can be done to better align the business case of the news and the objective portrayal of information that you believe is important for us to know today?
It's a very good question. I'm not an expert on the business side of news, and that's sort of on purpose. I made a deal when I got my first contract in TV that I said I would, I was delighted to have the chance, but I said I will only take the job on the chance that I have total editorial control. So you can never, for business reasons or any other reason, tell me to cover something or not to cover something or how to cover it. I need control. And because of that, because that's my overt agreement with my bosses, they don't involve me in discussions that maybe other people in my part of the business do get involved in terms of what business pressure is driving you toward. They don't tell me this is rating, therefore cover it. In the more holistic sense, in terms of the overall business, you can't engineer people's interests. And the news business is mostly a private business. And so people are going to demand what they want to see, and that's what will become remunerative, and then there will be more of it. And I think that's a process that's very hard to interrupt. That said, I think that there is a public service interest in making sure that we've got professional news. A lot of the ways that they've tried to deal with it at the local news gathering level is by getting rid of reporters and editors and instead doing self-reported and citizen-reported news. And that's exciting because it gets lots of people involved, but there ought to be an editor and there ought to be journalistic standards. And when we lose that at the local level, whether it's local TV stations or local newspapers, that is something as a country that I almost feel like we need a AmeriCorps type investment in. I don't know that there's a silver bullet for it, but I do know that what people say they want and what they want is different. Everybody says, like, God, I just want in-depth, investigative, straight up, totally objective, PBS-style, long-form reporting. That's all I want. That exists. And it's not what people choose when they have other options.
Let's get a question from this side of the room. There's one here in the middle. You, sir? Yep.
Hi, my name is Matthew. With the emergence of online streaming services such as Netflix or Amazon Prime, how do you see cable news or news in general adapting to this change?
That is again, I'm not an expert on the business side of things, but that is a heart attack in a bottle for everybody who works on the third floor of 30 Rockefeller Center. There's very little live television anymore, right? There's sports is live, right? And it's more fun to watch the game live than it is to watch it time delayed. News is live, sort of. There are certain shows on some of our competing networks that are run every night hours after they're taped, which I find amazing, but that's true. And it's expensive to produce news. So there is this idea that there should be like Bill Maher-style programming. Netflix did Chelsea Handler, who did like a topical talk show news approach thing. There's been, Vice is going to be doing a thing that's going to be streaming, that's going to be apparently some sort of daily news thing. The problem that people haven't figured out is that those streaming services almost always have a quality of time shifting to them, and news is a thing that's very hard to time shift. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'll tell you one thing. If Donald Trump is elected on November 8th, I know that I don't get Thanksgiving off. Right? Like, November's going to be very busy because people are going to be freaking the F out. If Hillary Clinton is elected president, I probably get Thanksgiving because people sort of know how things are going to go. And there'll be a lot of news to cover, but in terms of the like energetic, live, focus, you can never go home feeling at my work, that goes away. And it's more likely than not that Hillary Clinton will beat Donald Trump, and then we'll go back into a very normal news setting. And I don't know how many cable news environments survive 8 years of that.
Question? Have we got?
Yeah.
Okay, one here.
Yeah.
Good. By all means. You got the microphone? Yes, you. The microphone was just behind you, but now it's just coming.
Right here,
it's just coming.
2 rows down. There you
Here
go.
we are. Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Hi, thank you. My name is Alex. I guess my question for you is a little bit more personal about your experience. I'm curious, as a woman who does not look, as you mentioned, like a lot of the women in your industry, or as a woman who, quote, looks like a dude, have you run into any issues with that, like not presenting the way that other women in your industry present? Or how has that experience been? And how did you make the decision to continue like looking like yourself in your industry?
The first paid TV job I ever had in cable news was on a show that was hosted by Tucker Carlson. It was late night. It wasn't like 11 o'clock. It was really late. And Tucker's show on MSNBC was the last show on that network that ever had a wardrobe line item in the budget. They stopped doing that eventually. But he had and Tucker Carlson, the one thing that he was famous for forever was that he's a very natty dresser, right? He always wore a suit and a bow tie. He doesn't wear the bow tie anymore. But that was kind of the one thing he was known for. But he had this line item in his budget. He didn't need wardrobe. They kept the line item in the budget because they were so scared that they hired me. And they had the last wardrobe person in all of MSNBC take me on as a project to try to make me look approachable to be on television, and it was such a disaster. It was really sad. She's trying to do her best, but she'd bring in these jackets with tufted shoulder pads, and they were sort of in floral upholstery fabric and stuff, and I'd be like, it was just a disaster. And I've definitely looked bad on TV a lot, but eventually, by the time I had my own show in 2008, I kind of figured out all right, what I need to do is I need to kind of look the same every day. I don't look like the other women on cable news. That's fine. I'm not trying to compete. You're not going to hurt my feelings if you tell me that I'm not pretty. I'm not trying to be pretty. But I don't want the visual of me to be so distracting on a day-to-day basis that becomes the way that people talk about me being on TV. Get used to me once. That's it. And then I'll always... So I think of this as my jumpsuit. It's I zip into it every day. And actually, it got worse better for me, worse. At some point in the primary season this year, I decided, you know what? I've been doing this radical thing where I've been going between gray and black in terms of my outfits and stuff. I'm just going to stick with black. And so I did. I went and bought 5 shirts like this. They have a slightly lower collar. They're all the exact same thing. And then I have 6 of the same jacket. And I just wear, it's like a Guantanamo jumpsuit. So I just wear the same thing every day. And my whole mantra about it has been that I don't want you to be paying so much attention to how weird I look that you can't focus on what's coming out of my mouth. And so I want to look the way I want to look, but I'm just picking one. And that's it. And so one of the other things that happens on cable is that for a lot of women, it's kind of like a fashion show. They keep the wardrobe line items. They wear designer outfits. They have somebody dress them. That's part of what their preparation for their show is like. I just don't want that. And I'm happy with how I look, and I hope that it's just sort of disappeared. In terms of whether or not it's ever been a problem for me, I don't know, because I've never been anything other than me.
Isn't that the key? Don't you think that so many politicians and maybe people on television who try to be something other than they are fail? And the ones who succeed are the ones who just are themselves, and the most improbable people come out because people look at them and say, gosh, they're genuine. They're telling me something I didn't know. Mm-hmm. And it works, whether it's politicians or people on TV. It's the artificiality that people see through.
Even if you present something that is weird or hard to look at or unusual, think about Bernie Sanders' hair.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We've spent all of these decades talking about Teflon politicians, and everybody has to be
absolutely.
So. You know what? If you can be a thing that's hard to deal with, if you give people time to get used to it.
Yes.
Give people time to get used to whatever is ugly or weird or quirky or discordant about you, but then just stay that way, because then the second and the third and the fourth time, we're now used to Donald Trump's hair too. You know, it just be the thing that you are, and eventually, if you have staying power, because people are interested enough in you, they will be inured to your weirdness, and it will no longer seem like the only thing they can absorb about you.
Now, in the show tonight, you have an exclusive interview with the next Vice President of the United States, Senator Tim Kaine. And what I want to do is to ask the audience here now to suggest 3 questions which you might put to Tim Kaine.
Okay.
Now, you don't have to tell us which one you're going to choose of these 3, because word might leak out to him. So we're not going to take that risk.
Okay. So
you will choose yourself which question to put to him tonight. Now,
thank you for helping me do my homework.
3 questions from the audience for the next Vice President of the United States.
Just
Here's
shout,
one at the
shout
back.
them out.
Short questions.
My question for him would be if he could make one systematic change to the American democracy, what would that systematic change be?
So if there was one systematic change to American democratic arrangements, what would that one change be?
Simple example
Yep.
would be like term limits to Congress members.
Yeah.
Right. Or
Great
get
question.
gerrymandering
Number
or
one.
something. Got it. Got it.
Number two. Who would like to come up with number two? Is there someone?
The teal shirt in the back there.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sark, and what value do you think third parties have in elections? As in, is the need to give people an avenue to voice their opinions greater than the need to maintain a unified forum against two candidates?
Excellent. So what is the value of a third party in the American system? Do we need it to give an opportunity for people like Bernie Sanders and others to express their views?
I have no idea what he would say to that. That's
Yeah,
super interesting.
question. Third question, one here. Oh, sorry. Yes.
I was just going to ask, how many harmonicas does he have on him at the moment?
Okay. That could be a bonus question at the end.
Exactly.
And the
Show me your harmonica, sir.
gentleman behind.
My name is Brent Rachopi. Often the vice presidential candidate is picked because they complement maybe something that the presidential candidate doesn't have. So what will he complement her on with the vast amount of experience that she has?
Other than the harmonica.
Excellent. Okay.
That's
Well,
very
we put together, I think, the
very
remit
good.
for the Rachel Maddow show tonight.
Yeah.
And I think we should all express enormous appreciation to Rachel for coming along today. It's been Now we have, in the typical Stern tradition, we have a gift for Rachel, which is in complete inverse proportion to the excitement and the enjoyment of her contribution today. So it is a rather small present. But Rachel, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Mervyn. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
I love it. Thank you. That's very kind. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah.
The next will be one more event like this before the end of the semester, but we won't tell you what now.